Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about RPG mechanics, particularly as they relate to player characters in video games. And it's part of a larger series of videos that I'm doing about game design issues and game design thoughts. And in this one, I'm going to focus on not the mechanics of these things, but some design thoughts, particularly things that you might want to think about when you're designing these things, some thoughts about the effects of particular decisions. And this builds on the videos that have come before it in this short series, where I have focused more on mechanics. So if you know all about the mechanics that are going to be talked about, which are character stats and XP and leveling and skill trees, then you can dive straight in here. But otherwise, I encourage you to go and have a watch of those earlier videos. So here we go. I'm going to talk about stats first, and so I'm basically going to do each of these three concepts in turn and just give some thoughts about them. Some of these are as stated as directives, some of them are stated as questions to ask yourself. This first one obviously is a directive, which is when you have stats, make them understandable. I made the mistake in a game setting that I created where there's a stat called Nouse, which was meant to be kind of street smarts kind of thing, and it's a Yorkshire dialect word for that kind of thing, but it tripped people up when they were trying to use it. Make them have a real effect. So when you have a stat, it's easy to start from the point of view of thinking, right, I've got to have a character. What do I need to represent a character? And go down, a fairly standard route of strength, agility, and so on. But if you don't need them for your game, then don't have them. Uh, it, it's pointless stats are obviously pointless, but they can distract the player. And then similarly make them appropriate to the game. So if you've got a game that involves a lot of parkour, then some kind of agility stat might be appropriate. And there are some fine nuances between things like agility and dexterity, because agility is like what you might call gross body skills, and dexterity is more about fine motor skills. And so pick the words, but also pick the effects for the appropriateness to your game. Beware of luck. Um, this comes under the category of a stat that has wide-reaching effects. Because generally, if you've got a luck stat, the way to make that have any meaning in your game is that you'll do something to your random numbers, and either do something that means you never get disastrous numbers, or that you always get slightly more beneficial numbers than other people. And even a small tweak in this kind of area can have a huge impact over time for a character. So this has been done in games and in pen and paper games as well, but I think it's quite a dangerous one. And if you're going to use it, then I think make sure that the use is actually quite minimal. Beware stats that affect too many things. So it's kind of a similar thing to the look. I was talking about my game that I had with the now stat in it. In the same system, I had a coordination skill, which affected both um, use of some weapons, but also your chance to dodge. And because it was used in two significant areas, it became the killer stat. And so, if you particularly chose the right build, you could use this to make your character unbalanced. And I'm going to be talking about balance in the next video in this series. But it's worth thinking about this at the kind of in the design stages. So I'm going to move on now to talk about XP and levels and things to do with that part of the RPG system. So the first question is, do you need it? And the answer may clearly be yes, but if you're unsure, then there may be good reasons for not going down this route. So not all RPGs have it. Certainly not all pen and paper RPGs have it. I would say from my looker, I've been looking at a lot of these systems recently. I would guess about somewhere between half and 2/3 of RPG systems have some kind of XP-based leveling system. By no means all of them do. And it depends on your game as to whether it's a useful mechanic or not. It adds complexity to the design and potentially to the gameplay as well. It gives a structure that you can use for advancement. It can be quite useful. It can give understanding. Players are well used to understanding this, or most are. You're always going to have beginner players, and remember, you need to be careful to be inclusive and to help them learn how to play your game. It does break immersion, potentially, this idea of leveling. It's a meta idea, and if you want a strongly immersive game, then you might want to avoid it. Um, Linear games have their own progress driver, so if you have a game that has got a very strong and linear story, you already have a way of mapping your progress through the game. And I would suggest that these kind of games are ones where you may want to think very carefully about whether you want an XP and leveling system, because you can do similar things using the linearity of the game, either through the quests or through the story, or even spatially as a way of unlocking things. So I would say be careful of having two competing progress drivers in a game, and XP is one. So if you've got another strong one, then that could be somewhere where you might get a clash and things get complicated, and so you might want to avoid it. So if you do have your XP and your levels, I would encourage you to think about your timeline of your game, and to think about when you want your player to be leveling. So I've done another video, go and look at it if you haven't seen it already, which is all about game timelines, and planning timelines, and good designers taking control over this. It's fairly typical for games that have XP and levels for this to be in a kind of diminished return way. So you level up fairly quickly within your first playing session. Usually you level up at least once, maybe twice, possibly even 3 times, depending on how generous you are. What you don't want to do is to keep that rate of leveling up. You want early rewards. This is kind of well known. So the kind of rate of reward usually, all of the things being equal, tends to spread out and become further apart. And the best way to work out effectively how many XP you're going to want for each level is to work it out backwards. And I talked about that in an earlier video in this series. But is to do this thing where you think, what's the timeline? How far apart do I want these leveling effects to be? If I've got things in my game timeline where it's important that the player gets to a certain power before they reach this thing, then you need to make sure that that's built in. Often it's done in terms of how many encounters the player will have before between leveling up and before they level up for the next time. So you can work it out from that. If you know how many encounters, you know how much XP you're giving as rewards for these encounters, you can then work out what the XP threshold should be that way. So I would just reiterate the same thing again. I would strongly encourage you to do this working backwards so that you take control over when a player levels up, which is more important than the actual number of the XP. Um, but that's the thing that actually drives it. Okay. And then obviously alongside that is the question, how many levels are you going to have? And I've seen games with all sorts of extremes in this. Um, so you could get quite high numbers. Um, you could be leveling 1 to 100, or you could have this lower 1 to 20, and it depends on the feel of your game, the complexity of the game, the length of the game. So remember things like if you decide that you want to spread these levels out more and have fewer levels, and you've got a skill tree, then these two interact, and you're going to need to be aware of that uh, because you're probably doing skill points or some kind of system like that based on when you level up. Okay. And then there's another question, which is kind of future proofing your system, which is it may be that you're designing a game that has 30 levels, let's say, for the sake of argument, and it's successful. And so the company that you're working in decide that it would be a good idea to create some DLC to expand this to level 40. And so the question is your leveling system future proof? And most of the time, there's not a big problem with this, but you've got to be careful of anything that you put in that might ruin that or might mean that makes the game difficult to expand. If you've gone from a lowly kind of weedy person who can't do anything to your level cap at level 30, they're basically a demigod, and they can do almost anything that can be thrown at them. Where do you go from there? So you've got to leave that headroom, a room for expansion, and presumably that'll come along with expanded challenge as well. Um, but yeah, so it's worth thinking about. Um, just a couple of things to think about of one of the alternative ways of doing progress, which is to level in individual skills or to improve individual skills as you go along, rather than having a centralized leveling system. And these thoughts are firstly that it feels more natural because it means that the experience you gain in that particular skill comes from using that particular skill. And so it encourages that feedback loop, which is, of course, how things really work in the real world. Not that we have any numbers in terms of how much experience we have at whatever skill we're talking about, knitting or something like that. Um, but the more you knit, the better you get at knitting. Uh, it's more complex, potentially, so be aware of that if you're building in this complexity. Um, I mean, it's complex in that you've got more numbers going on. It might be able to be presented as a simpler system to the player, though. It encourages specialization, which in some ways is a good thing. So if you want your players to specialize, this particularly want to talk about weapons. And if you're in a fantasy setting, often I'm thinking in fantasy settings because that's kind of where I live. You might have a sword-based skill, and so you encourages players to really work at their sword skills and to combat with swords. But the flip side of that coin is that it discourages change, um, and players are reluctant to effectively discard all that work that they've done just because a nice axe comes along and they're all skilled up in sword. It gives them this kind of dilemma that they've got this axe, and maybe their skill is zero in axe right now. So do they want to use it? Um, and so this obviously is a phenomenon you can as a designer use this to your advantage if you want, because I've just described the fact that the player has this quandary, and a quandary is a choice, and this is giving player choices. So if your system tips it too much in the way of the specialization, then you're going to take away that choice. You're going to kind of basically force them down the route of staying with their specialization. So that's something to think about as a designer. Okay, I'm going to move on, and finally, I'm going to talk about skills. This is skill trees, perk trees, all these sort of things. I have done a video on describing these mechanics, which comes earlier than this in this series of videos. So check that out if you want to know more about the mechanics. I'm just going to talk about obviously some design thoughts for skills. So using trees, which is a popular way of doing this, which is where you have to have previous skills in the tree to unlock the ability to get to later skills. And one of the effects of this is that it has a gating effect on power. Gating is this idea that you have a barrier against the player being able to get to something until you're ready as a designer for them to have that. And some skills at the extreme ends of trees can be incredibly powerful. And what you don't want is a system in which the player can get too powerful too early. So this is why trees are very often used. Some kind of gating on it. You might also have level restrictions on some skills, which can aid this as well. So you can do both mechanics, and players will accept that quite readily. It guides specialization. So obviously, trees skills are a way of specializing, and skill trees are often done in such a way that you've got broad areas that are indicated. Maybe things are different colors or labeled as healing magic versus fire magic versus conjuring magic, etc. So yes, obviously magic's an area where specialization and skill trees, more like kind of spell trees, can come into play. So it guides that specialization process, and players will often kind of make an early decision about which way they're going to specialize, and then stick to it. What you don't necessarily want to do is to make that too much on rails, so that there are obvious routes that they should go down. You should, yeah, because if you do that, then you reduce your skill tree and the fact that you've got this choice for players in there. You reduce it down to one early choice, and there's really no point in having it as a tree if you're not just going to automatically unlock things once you've chosen your path, for example. Skill point economy I want to talk about, because a lot of systems for this use some kind of point system for buying your skills as you go through the tree. That it could be as simple as 1 point per skill, and then you have your gating effects to make sure that they can't pick the really powerful ones early on. But it could be different to that. It could be different amounts of points depending on the skill, which is obviously a thing that can happen for balancing. So it probably relates to the number of levels. Most skill systems seem to work on the basis that when you level up, you get a skill point or several skill points. So the final number of skill points that you've got over the course of the game is determined by the number of levels that you've got. I suggest I don't know if it's a good idea to have randomized numbers of skill points. I think that's quite poor. I think having different skill points, numbers of skill points at different levels, is interesting, but you'd need to be quite careful with that, especially if players didn't know what was coming. They could get disappointed when there are low numbers, and you don't want disappointed players because they wander off and play something else instead. And then you want to think about where the player is going to be able to get to in your skill tree with the number of skill points that they're going to be given over the course of the game. And so you do want it so that they can get to one of the powerful skills that are at the ends of the trees, and it's a fairly normal thing to have some really attractive things at the extreme ends of these skill trees, which draw the player down. They will look. You really, really, I think, shouldn't have a skill tree where you only see the next level and can't work out what's going to happen further down the line. That's just such a waste of an opportunity where you can give the player some advance thought of where to go, and that will keep them playing when they're playing down and trying to get towards that ultimate skill at the end. So there should be enough points to get to one of these powerful ones at the end. It's a badly designed system if you can never get to these things that are promised. Um, you probably want to give them some spare points as well, so that it's not just exactly the right amount to get down to one of the most powerful ones on the end. I guess a caveat of that is depends on how you structure your tree. So sometimes there are different paths to come down. Um, but if what you do is give them exactly the right number of points for them to get on any particular branch of your tree to one of these endpoints, and no more, then actually you are once again removing the choice, because once they're set out and they're committed, then they know what their tree path is at that point. And so you should give them more points than that, um, so that there should be the chance to take up a few skills in different areas and to have a little bit more flavour to it. Um, but you don't want so much that you end up generalising. So if you have 30 skills in total in your game, and each one costs 1 point, and you've got some kind of tree system, but then you've got 30 levels, and each time you level, you get 1 skill point. Then everybody who's going to get to the end has got all the skills, and you've ended up the same at the start, different during the middle, and then the same again at the end. And it takes away that feeling of specialisation, and you end up in a situation like this. I couldn't resist this picture. Um, so you want fewer than that. Okay. Um, in the same way of bewaring of luck, I would say beware of XP bonus stuff in your skills, because once you give a percentage increase to XP gained, that has a very long term effect and it's highly accumulative. Um, as a player, if I see any perk or skill or anything like that that gives me any kind of advantage in learning, which will help me go through the skill tree faster or level up faster or do anything that will help me advance faster than the average player, I will automatically pick that because they are powerful. And so, from the other side, as a designer, I would say be really careful about this. Now, it's just thoughts just flashed into my head. I have these kind of evil thoughts. If you have a freemium game, um, and I think you might know where I'm going here, you might have skills that you can buy that you can only buy with real money, and skills that you can buy with in-game money. And I'm hoping later to do some video stuff about game economies, and I'll fold into that some stuff about freemium economies. Um, this would be a prime candidate for being a premium skill or something you automatically give premium subscribers or something like that, is just to give them the ability to progress faster. But you need to be careful that it's not breaking your game. Because if your progress is linked to your content, then you'll end up with overpowered players too quickly. Okay. Um, I guess another question then about going back to skill trees generally, yes, is how much choice is a good thing? How big, how complex, how wide should your skill tree be? And there's a temptation as a designer, and I feel this when I'm designing things. I want to go big and grand, because I like games that feel big and grand, and I like designing things that feel big and grand. But remember that players can get overwhelmed with choice if they've got too many things that they're choosing. to do, and they don't understand necessarily the consequences of their choices. That makes it even worse. Um, and I don't know what a really good level of choice is. And I think it is fairly clear from the fact that different people play different types of games that actually this is personality dependent. Some people prefer more choices, but some people prefer less, and maybe prefer different things in different moods, because that can happen as well. But having said all that, I think I want to say when you're designing skill systems, be careful not to swamp the player with too much choice. Right, that's been a bit of a blast through some design thoughts. So that's it from me for now.